Odysseus, a valiant hero of the Greek epic The Odyssey that uses his cunning and wits to outsmart his opponents. Named best of Greeks and second only to Achilles in combat. Leader of men and lover of goddesses, champion of Athena and object of Poseidon's wrath. The soldier returned from war, the longed-for husband and anticipated wise father, a model for Greek heroism and masculinity. Bilbo Baggins, gentle inhabitant of the peaceful and lazy Shire, turned impromptu burglar. Small in size and easily excitable. Lover of maps, riddles, smoke rings, and plentiful meals. Self-proclaimed as he who walks unseen, clue finder, web cutter, stinging fly, ring winner, luck wearer, and barrel rider. Friend of elves, dwarves, men, and wizards, unwaveringly loyal and true. A model for the unexpected heroism that can reside in the smallest of persons. What might Homer's mighty hero of the Greeks and Tolkien's awakened hero of the Shire have in common? What does the Odyssey and the Hobbit have in common? What might the differences within those similarities reveal to us about both stories? In this video, I hope to answer those questions and perhaps shed some light on why Tolkien became the father of modern fantasy. Before we discuss many of the similarities between Bilbo and Odysseus' journey, we need to observe the thing that ties them so closely together, the trickster archetype. But first, what is an archetype? A concept introduced by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, the term was first used in a 1919 essay entitled Instinct and the Unconscious. Jung defines an archetype as forms or images of a collective nature which occur practically all over the earth as constituents of myths, and at the same time as autochthonous individual products of unconscious origin. More simply, a collectively inherited unconscious idea, pattern of thought, image, etc., universally present in individual psyches. It's important to note that the trickster is derived from Jung's archetype of the fool, and many considered the trickster to be more appropriately classified as a stock character. The trickster is often a cunning, trickster. They shape the world through their inspired schemes, fool enemies with their wit, and tackle obstacles with the power of their minds. The trickster is mischievous, deceitful, curious, and chaotic. They break through the mold of conformity. They are sometimes foolish, and at times self-destructive. Often the trickster is put up against opponents far more formidable than themselves. When we think of the trickster, we think of the Norse god Loki. In Hinduism, we think of Krishna. In Greek mythology, Hermes, to whom Odysseus is related. In literature and fairy tales, Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, the kitsune of Japanese folklore, and Rumpelstiltskin. In pop culture, the trickster is Bugs Bunny, Jack Sparrow, Tyrion Lannister, the Joker, and Charlie Chaplin's The Little Tramp. You'll notice that many of the characters I have listed have vastly different personalities, goals, and backgrounds, but all of these give us a different iteration of the same archetype, being that of the trickster. We can first conceive the differences between the types of heroes in the opening lines of The Hobbit's first chapter. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. The circumstances surrounding Odysseus and Bilbo are vastly different. Odysseus is in a state of distress and turmoil. Odysseus longs for home. The queenly nymph sought out the great Odysseus and found him there on the headland, sitting, still weeping, his eyes never dry, his sweet life flowing away with the tears he wept for his foiled journey home. Bilbo is at home, comfortable, and at peace. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. These opening lines and first descriptions of Bilbo cast him as an unlikely sort for great adventure and valiant deeds. So it's a bit surprising when Gandalf appears and picks Bilbo, of all people, to be the 14th member of the group. We can find reason for Gandalf's decision to include Bilbo in The Quest of Erebor, which is part of Tolkien's originally unpublished works, published by Christopher Tolkien in a collection titled Unfinished Tales in 1980. This text gives us 3 distinct reasons Gandalf had for choosing Bilbo. 1. Bilbo seemed to show an interest in the world outside the Shire's borders. 2. Smaug would not recognize the scent of Bilbo, because he'd never encountered hobbits before. And 3. He believed Thorin's doubt in Bilbo's abilities and poor opinion of hobbits in general might keep him from acting too rashly. But perhaps we may grasp some larger reason for why Gandalf would pick Bilbo if we considered Gandalf's origins. Starting to think we aren't talking about the Odyssey anymore? Bear with me for a moment. Gandalf is not simply a wizard, not a mere conjurer of cheap tricks. Thanks, Peter Jackson. Gandalf is what is known as a Maiar. The Silmarillion is a collection of much of Tolkien's unfinished works that establishes the mythology of Tolkien's legendarium. And in this mythology, Gandalf is what would amount to a minor god. Because of this, Gandalf serves as a kind of Athena-like figure to Bilbo and company, though Gandalf's character lay under a different archetype from Bilbo and Odysseus, that being the archetype of the wise old man. If we consult the Psychology Wiki, it lists some traits of the wise old man that fit Gandalf all too well. This type of character is typically represented as a kind and wise old father-type figure who uses personal knowledge of people and the world to help tell stories and offer guidance that, in a mystical way, may impress upon his audience a sense of who they are and who they might become, thereby acting as a mentor. He may occasionally appear as an absent-minded professor, appearing absent-minded due to his predilection for contemplative pursuits. The wise old man is often seen to be in some way foreign, that is, from a different culture, nation, or occasionally even a different time from those he advises. In extreme cases, he may be a liminal being, such as Merlin, who's only half human. This is the case with Gandalf. Pay special attention to impress upon his audience a sense of who they are and who they might become. It's only after Gandalf carefully orchestrates Bilbo's meeting with the dwarves that he is able to draw out Bilbo's quote-unquote inner Took side. I have a theory that Gandalf used a method of introducing the dwarves to intrigue Bilbo and arouse his Tookish curiosity, similar to the way he introduced the party to Beorn later in the novel. After the dwarves arrive and play their music, we begin to see the first embers of the change that will overcome Bilbo by the end of the novel. Then something Tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. While we can reasonably assume that Odysseus goes to Troy out of obligation, and perhaps to make a name for himself, Bilbo seems to be enticed by adventure for the sake of adventure, to experience things outside of himself and the small world he has known. There are several Homeric similarities in the party's first dangerous encounter. After discovering the Cyclops' cave, Odysseus' crew desired to take some food and leave, but Odysseus desired to linger. Bilbo, like Odysseus, desired to gain something from this encounter. He was very much alarmed, as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet, somehow, he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. The trolls, like Polyphemus, are all drunk and have a desire to eat the dwarves, catching them while they approach the fire in search of Bilbo. When Thorin, coming last, reaches the edge of the fire ring, he fights the trolls, hitting one in the eye with a burning brand in the process. As Keith J. Retford wrote in a journal article for Mythlore entitled There and Back Again, Odysseus and Bilbo Baggins, here more than anywhere we are reminded of Homer. A big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside. Both the placing of this episode and the details of the fight given earlier suggest Homer's influence on Tolkien. Luckily for the dwarves, Gandalf arrives and rescues them with his own Odyssean-like trickery. chapter Riddles in the Dark sees Bilbo cast more clearly as a trickster-type character, but notably sets him apart from Odysseus in a specific way that helps us begin to understand Tolkien's interpretation of heroism. Bilbo's composure in this chapter is night and day from the little fellow bobbing on the mat, who fell on the floor shrieking at the mere mention of a dragon in the Lonely Mountain in Chapter 1. The chapter begins with Bilbo scrabbling around in the dark, finding the ring, which he puts in his pocket without much thought, and encountering the creature Gollum. When asked about who and what he is, he does not stutter this time, telling Gollum plainly who he is and agreeing to sit and speak with him.
What is it, my precious?
I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins.
A game of riddles soon begins with Bilbo's life on the line. This battle of wits is typical for the trickster archetype and is a reoccurring challenge faced by heroes in literature throughout history. And Bilbo's true trickster-like act in the game of riddles is his bending of the rules. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said aloud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and he was frightfully upset. Although Bilbo speaks aloud on accident, he quickly uses it to his advantage after seeing how off-put Gollum is by the question. In his annotated version of The Hobbit, Douglas A. Anderson notes that this kind of violation of the rules of the game, this questionable non-riddle as he puts it, occurs in the Norse mythological tales of the Lay of Fahrundir and the saga of King Hedric the Wise, in both of which Odin appears in disguise and engages in a battle of wits with a giant and a king. Undoubtedly, Bilbo's trickster-like qualities in this chapter are taken more from Norse and Anglo-Saxon mythology, but they cast him as a trickster, nonetheless. When Bilbo learns of the ring's magical properties, he quickly devises a plan to follow Gollum in the hopes of being led to an exit. What occurs next is a pivotal moment in the Legendarium and distinctly sets Bilbo apart from Odysseus as both a hero and a trickster. Gollum stops at the mouth of the exit and seems to sense Bilbo, who is wearing the ring. Bilbo seems to have no way around Gollum without giving himself away. He must get away, out of this horrible darkness, while he had any strength left. He must fight, he must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or tried to yet. And he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror, welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of the endless unmarked days without light or hope of betterment, hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled. And then quite suddenly, in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leapt. Odysseus in a similar situation would put Gollum's eyes out at the least, and kill him at the worst. As with the suitors, offense and obstruction of his goals was enough to justify killing for Odysseus. Bilbo stays his hand, which proves to be vitally important, as Gandalf says to Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring when Frodo comments it was a pity Bilbo didn't kill Gollum. Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand, pity and mercy not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. In The Hobbit, this is a large growing moment for Bilbo, as he sees how depraved Gollum has become sitting in the dark with only one piece of quote-unquote treasure. It proves to impact his decision later regarding the dragon, his opposition to Thorin's greed, and what to do with the Arkenstone. The dwarves often play the role of Odysseus' crew in The Hobbit. They seem to be responsible for certain predicaments that could have been avoided and end up needing to be rescued by Bilbo. After Bilbo saves the dwarves from the spiders in Mirkwood, they are taken prisoner by the elves. Bilbo, like Odysseus, then sets to work on trying to free his companions from their cells and find a way out of the cave-like dungeon of the Elf King. The way Bilbo orchestrates their escape is strikingly similar to how Odysseus frees his own crew from Polyphemus' cave. Bilbo discovers the Water Gate as an alternative exit to the dungeon and begins to formulate a plan. When he notices the chief of guards going off with another elf to begin drinking the king's wine, he follows and waits for the chief to fall asleep so he can retrieve the Selkies. This is reminiscent of Odysseus offering Polyphemus wine to put the Cyclops to sleep to initiate his own plan. Bilbo then cleverly hides the dwarves in empty wine barrels that are meant to be sent downriver, just as Odysseus has his men latch themselves onto the bellies of sheep to hide from Polyphemus's hand searching blindly for them. In both cases, their captors are the ones who ultimately set them free. Polyphemus by removing the rock from the mouth of the cave, the elves by sending the empty wine barrels downstream to Lake Town. Both Homer and Tolkien slowly unravel the hero's plan as it takes place, and while the hero manages to escape, they end up paying for it in some way later. Bilbo's true encounter with Smaug occurs the second time he descends down the narrow hidden passage. It's important to observe that Bilbo is engaging with Smaug because he ultimately seeks a way to deal with the dragon and return the dwarves to their home, allowing him to return home as well. Odysseus lingers in the cave despite the protest of his men, seeking to meet the cave's owner and see what gifts he may give. Like Odysseus, Bilbo is courteous with Smaug and uses fine language to manipulate the dragon. Truly, songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug, the chieftest and greatest of calamities. Both Smaug and Polyphemus are categorically prideful, and in the face of such flattery seek out information about their guest, both aiming to take further advantage of them. "Who are you, and where do you come from, may I ask? Where did you moor your sturdy ship when you arrived? Up coast or close in? I'd just like to know." Both Odysseus and Bilbo see the hidden threat behind these questions, however, and evade them. Bilbo gives a riddling reply. "I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led, and through the air I am he who walks unseen." This is similar to Odysseus hiding his name by calling himself Nobody. Bilbo's encounter with Smaug holds more similarity with the Eddic poem, The Lay of Fafnir, than it does with the Odyssey. Scholars such as Tom A. Shippey have analyzed Tolkien's work alongside Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Germanic literature. However, there are two similarities between Odysseus' encounter with Polyphemus and Bilbo's encounter with Smaug that stand out. First, that Smaug and Polyphemus identify their unwelcome guest, and second, that Bilbo and Odysseus give a mocking parting shot that incurs the monster's wrath. Odysseus pridefully boasts his name so that the monster might tell others who blinded him. In response, Polyphemus prays to Poseidon, his father, to curse Odysseus so that he may never return home, or barring that, he returns with all his shipmates dead, a broken man, in a stranger's ship with trouble brewing at home. Bilbo, becoming full of himself, clumsily lists Barrel Rider as one of his many titles, which implicates the men of the lake as the perpetrators of his intrusion. In response, Smaug sneaks his way out of the mountain, aiming to smite the intruders on the side of the mountain. Failing that, he turns his attention to Lake Town to seek his vengeance. Consequently, both their actions result in the suffering of others. Bilbo's great challenge at the end of his story is not about killing the dragon or fighting off the forces that march on the Lonely Mountain, seeking treasure or payment. Instead, his challenge is to bring peace between the forces of men, elves, and dwarves. Bilbo is able to make up for his involvement in the dragon's attack on Lake Town and facilitate this peace by offering up his share of the treasure to compensate for damages done to the men of the lake and pay the dragon slayer Bard for slaying Smaug. This is juxtaposed to Odysseus, who wages a war against the suitors occupying his home. By comparing the ending of these two stories, we can see the difference in Homer's model for a hero and Tolkien's more clearly. Odysseus wins the respect of others for the use of his wits as a weapon of war. He brings glory and riches to his house through his escapades. Bilbo's value as a hero is not in his skill in battle or cunningly won victories, but in his altruism. He cares little for gold or guest gifts. Instead, he seeks out the simple pleasures that can be shared with others. Thorne notes on his deathbed, "If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world." While it is the consensus of Tolkien's scholars that much of the inspiration for his work comes from Norse and Germanic mythology, as well as old tales such as Beowulf, there seems to be a reasonable amount of overlap in some of the Hobbit's story and characters to conclude that Tolkien may have been influenced by the Greek epic poem, though it being perhaps limited and minimal at best. Looking at the Silmarillion's pantheon for Middle-earth, we can see it reflects that of Greek mythology with Christian overtones. So maybe Greek mythology and tales were on Tolkien's mind as well when he began to shape Middle-earth. Furthermore, the Hobbit's archetypal similarities with the Odyssey are undeniable. Homer's influence on Tolkien might not have been direct, but I would find it hard to believe that Odysseus and his perilous journey didn't cross Tolkien's mind while he was writing Bilbo's own Odyssey, to the lonely mountain and back again to the warmth of the hearth at Bag End.